Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining us again for another CONVERGED User Group Professional Series. The goal of this series is to better equip the community with best practices and share ideas from the experience of our board members and get that out to you. A lot of the topics came through from surveys, and today we're on the third session. We've already assessed our infrastructure. We've then worked on the financial analysis. Now we're going to develop the perfect pitch to prepare your IT budget for the next financial year. And we've got some other cases in here that we'll talk to. I'm joined today by Nigel Moulton, advisor to the CONVERGED User Group Board of Directors, and Chris Stanley, Board of Director and from LoopUp, Head of IT and Security at LoopUp. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks for taking the time.
Good to be here, Dave.
Good to have you and good to see you again.
Yeah.
You know, when we dive into the conversation, why are you putting this pitch together, or how are you thinking about the whys to this pitch that are setting everything up? So talk me through that. Nigel, what are some reasons? Why would you be doing this?
So I think the main reason is what you touched on, actually, which is the look. At some point, you're going to have to prepare a budget for your next financial year. And that budget will classically be split into sort of different areas around capital expense, operational, sort of headcount maybe. And so if I look at the sort of the capital side, then Chris talked to the operational side, because there's a shift, certainly when you move to more cloud-based operating models where perhaps the operational side of the expense starts to increase, right? But if we start with capital, this is the classic case of taking perhaps items in your IT inventory that are broken, they just need replacing, they need updating, right? And if the view is still that capital expense for those items is the right approach to take, then these just become line items in a budget in terms of things that you're planning to buy during the course of your fiscal year. And a good attempt, I would say, to put a number on the value that you're going to be sort of ascribing to those pieces of capital equipment. Right now, the world being what it is at the minute, I think there's a degree of flex in that in terms of some of the pricing that we're seeing. But the other question to sort of address is the extent to which capital expense is still preferred by your CFO, right? Because there are advantages to going down the capital route. In the UK, for example, there are tax breaks for doing it. These are assets, they can be valued, you can borrow money against them. So there's a view in some organizations that actually capital expense is good. And when viewed through that lens, it doesn't mean to say that you can't move away from a sort of a cloud operating model. You can still run, of course, that on-premise. But it perhaps sort of questions the extent to which you will continue to go to a pure cloud journey where cloud is something that you no longer host. It's actually something that's done off premise, right? So I think there's a reason for capital, and it's not always an IT reason. It's sometimes a financial and an accounting reason. But Chris, equally, as you move across to operational expense, there are some significant advantages to that as well, right?
Yeah, pretty much. With your operation expenditure, there's not so much of the big bang. The majority of budget's gone up front. Working in the hotel industry previously and hospitality, there was competition amongst different departments for budgets. So if you're doing your budget out a year out, it was harder to potentially get that lump sum of infrastructure overhaul for your data centers. As we see now, there's things like Microsoft 365. All these have made licensing over just monthly, the norm, and that's as certainly as I've moved businesses now to LoopUp, that we tend to more operate on the subscription kind of model, and that's I think it's more beneficial as long as you're not tied in for long terms. But be aware of those. I suppose capital expenditure, there was always you could tie in that support element of the first 3 years into one payment up front and just amortize it over internally.
Yeah, and I think the amortization is, the model is a sawtooth, right? It's purchase, amortize, and when you move to a more operational model, that becomes highly flexible based on sudden demand in the business, right? If you're in the hospitality business and you needed to sort of bring staff in on a temporary basis to manage a contact center, you wouldn't provision that in-house, right? You use cloud-based subscription services, right?
Very much, yeah. And I mean, headcount wise, it made more sense to flex into it that way as well.
Yeah, so I think headcount again is another one of these issues which we're going to get into slightly later. I think if we take a look at there's the capex and opex models, right, and then there's so why are you doing the capex model? Well, as I've already sort of suggested, you're replacing something which is at the end of its warrantable life, and the business no longer wants to be running mission critical applications on hardware that might be 4 or 5 years old. And the decision, therefore, to replace it with an equivalent, this year's model, for want of a better expression, I think is again lending itself to the sort of the capital model, right? Now, I know, Chris, in a previous role, you actually went through a change in technology, right? So you took sort of monolithic servers and storage and brought them together in a hyper-converged platform. So you were bringing new technology into that point. So, if you were debating that with a finance person, how would you sort of bring the new technology element into it?
Yeah, so I went from full data center refresh back in the day to a converged infrastructure to a hyper-converged infrastructure. And talking to maybe CFOs in some businesses, I suppose you would have to sell them the strategy as well. So it's not just this is what we need to do and that's for a few years. This is where the industry's going. Smaller footprints in data center is so if you're hosting your own services on site, then your costs are coming down, electricity wise, etc. And it's less to manage. So I suppose it's simplifying to that is the conversation, and less people to manage it because there's not 50 servers. You're now down to a stack of maybe 4 with a lot of elements built in that look after themselves.
And I think hyperconvergence is a great case in point, right? Of literally the convergences of technologies into a single platform that drive lower operational cost, increase the use of automation, which again reduces perhaps the time that engineers would spend patching and updating and doing highly manual processes, right? And I think in those cases, there's a pretty solid business case, right?
Yeah, very much so. People will always be your most expensive resource, and that will always go one way. Whereas the technology, it should become cheaper, and over time, depending on how you're doing it, and it also takes away some of those monotonous day-to-day things, patching, etc., that you'd employ a person to do when you can again help these people to go and build their careers, more things that would benefit the company again. So
yeah, so I think there's a solid business case reason. We'll touch on headcount again in just a second, because there's another reason why you might be making these sort of infrastructure investments, and that's because you're trying to prove a concept. So there's an experimental business case. There might be a new technology which is peripheral to the business that one of the line of business leaders has actually asked you to sort of help fund the IT element of them running a program or a project. And in these cases, I think the business case is actually pretty sketchy. It's not easy to justify why these investments are going to return, because they might not, right? They are experimental by their very, very nature. So I think in the cases that we've talked about so far, in the capital and the operational expense, the business case is usually pretty solid. In the case of the proof of concept, I think that's harder to justify. And then again, Chris, you talked about this, is the headcount one, right?
Yeah.
Because, we've talked a lot about reducing the headcount in IT. Actually, there are instances where you need to increase it. So again, if you think about some of the skill sets that you might not have in a business, it's the ability to bring those guys and girls in, right?
Very much, yeah. So people coming into your business as well, they would like to see a path, a roadmap of where the business is going as well. So if within your budgets, if you can show, I suppose, the key people that you want to bring into your business, this is our roadmap, this is our strategy, and how we're looking to budget over the next few years from a technology standpoint, then you will potentially get a better candidate as well.
Yeah, and certainly, I'm a CIO for a law firm here in the UK, and one of the roles that we're currently debating is an analyst role, because what the data and the big data methodologies we're deploying throughout the firm is teaching us is that building a bespoke reporting, building KPIs that sort of management teams within the law firm can use. The debate we're having right now is whether that's an IT function or whether that's a business development function, actually. I would prefer to see it in IT. I think that's where it more naturally sits. Chris, if you think about the sort of the data science, data analytics roles, I'd be inclined to position those as IT headcount, wouldn't you?
Yes, very much. And the budgets can dilute very quickly, and especially if different departments are demanding things or going ahead with purchases. And then if you're not sure of, or if you're unsure, there's not a determined point of who's looking after that budget, then that can quite easily get out of control, and you will be, have budgets or monies coming out that you hadn't planned for.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about contingency a little bit. Certainly during the COVID era, we in the law firm we built a COVID contingency, which was actually a reasonable percentage of the overall IT budget because we just didn't know. And I think as part of good planning, contingency should always be a function of this. Yeah,
and I think if it reflects on you, if you're present, who you're presenting to, if you have in mind, there is a figure that I would put in to my budget and say this is contingency. When you're asked for what, then you would say X, Y, Z. Some people might say, well, what are you doing that for? But it reflects good on the person presenting as well as, you've got to be aware of all the things. And had we had a crystal ball a couple of years ago before pandemics, then you say we might need to contingents for working at home or something in a certain scenario. It helps fully encompass everything, I suppose you're trying to get in that presentation.
So I think there's a good conversation there, Dave, right? But that's only part of it, right?
Fantastic. And so as you're preparing this pitch, you've got this concept of, okay, the perfect pitch is why do we need to do this, or why are we doing this? And you touched on a bunch of things that could be in that. What do we need to do is kind of blended in, but also follows the why. So what's going on that requires this? What do we need to do? And you solve those answers. Chris, we were talking earlier, and you had mentioned that, as much as you can prepare for these conversations and go in for the pitches, you're always going to get hit with questions. And a lot of times you're going to have to do follow-ups with those questions. This kind of gets us to the what is the audience you're up against, and how can you go in and really get the intel that you need before you get in with those audience members. Who are you presenting to? Does that change your pitch? Let's talk a little bit about that, and what are some lessons learned and some best practices that you guys have developed over the years?
Yeah, so I think so I'll jump in. I think from my side, it's a case of, look, you're going to have a stakeholder map, and there are going to be identified titles on there. And I think Chris is going to talk to sort of pitching to the CFO. My view is, across that stakeholder map, know who your friends are, know where your supporters are, actively go out to those line of business leaders or to those executives and share as much as you can around the work you're doing, why you're doing it, its importance to the company, and why an IT investment strategy along the lines that you're suggesting is actually the right thing to do. So getting buy-in across the stakeholders is in my opinion, key, right? Know if you're in the room and it's real life and you're standing up in front of these folks, know where the friendlies are, and know where it might not be so friendly. And Chris, at the end of the day, you've got to convince the CFO, right?
Very much, yeah. Having a good relationship with your CFO is vitally important to, I suppose, how your career will be supporting the projects you do in the future. If you vastly get the first one wrong through not going for anything, then he will have very little confidence in in you for your next one. And if you're going through quite a big project, something transformation wise, then it's going to be more of a difficult sell each time. So pitching to the CFO, it's breaking it down in previous roles where they haven't been technology savvy, of selling all the things, reducing headcount. Very much, that's what they like to hear. There's a cost saving there versus what we're currently going to put forward to is probably quite a bit of expenditure in a lot of these sort of transformation projects that we do. I also had to report into vice presidents as well, and again, the technology levels you have to gauge as you're pitching to these people, because ultimately they will determine on how these projects go for you in future, and what sort of budget you're going to get and what sort of projects you're likely to keep going on year. So definitely have them as a friendly.
Yeah, again, I think sometimes, IT's reporting line is up to an operational COO track or maybe a CFO track. So again, knowing which side of that fence you sit on, again, helps, right? CFOs, Chris, to your point, tend to think in, operational expense reduction and cost reduction. And operating officers tend to think more around efficiency and driving, higher levels of maybe automation in the IT function, let's say. But they're both cost conscious.
Yes.
And it's only if you're truly aligned with a sales or a marketing budget where you're going to perhaps get that extra degree of freedom, shall I say, to perhaps have an element of your budget that is more experimental in nature. And it will always be a blend. But I think, Chris, it's beholden on any IT professional to sort of, be transparent on up when it comes to actually asking for the money that we invariably ask for, right?
Yes, very much. And if you're being asked on things you do not know the answer to, do not in any way blag it. Be as honest and go away and or say on a second follow-up presentation that you'll do, or for any questions you'll take that away and get back to them just to ensure that you've got the right information, or you will don't be afraid to say I haven't got that information. It's very important that you have all as accurate information as possible, especially to these line of people you're presenting to.
Fantastic. Gentlemen, this has been a great conversation. If I think about it, you want to answer the question, why are we doing this and what do we need to do? Sometimes those are blended more than others, but you got to answer the why and what needs to happen. You have to know your audience. And Nigel, that concept of a stakeholder map, identify the friendlies, go out there. Chris, know what is the tech savviness of your audience. That's huge, depending on whether you're in a tech focused industry or a non-tech focused industry. You need to know the language that you're presenting to, or know what language the people who are listening speak, so that you can deliver it in their language.
Very much.
We've got, we're kind of at time now where hopefully we've set the stage and folks want to ask us questions. We will take a quick pause, shift over to the Q&A portion, maybe change our wardrobe. So if you haven't asked a question, throw them into the chat, and very shortly we will get ready to answer those questions. Thank you. All righty. So if everything worked, we're here. Nigel, how are you doing? Can you hear me?
I'm doing good, thank you. Very good.
Right.
Very good.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. And thanks everybody for joining us. Unfortunately, Chris Stanley had to step out. He is dealing with some issues, and as we all know with IT, things always pop up. It's not a matter of if, but when, and we're just glad that we got him on for earlier for you folks. Nigel, we've got some questions in here.
Yep.
And I guess what we could do, let's just hit them backwards here. So I'll read this out. Russ says, who is the one stakeholder that you should always involve? Oh boy, that one sounds like the answer would be your boss. But Nigel, let's weigh in.
Well, so ultimately you're having to convince somebody in a finance role about the budget and how you're going to spend it. So the stakeholder whom you ultimately need involved is the CFO or somebody in the CFO's office. Again, as we talked about in the video, you might have some friendly people that you can talk to across the business. But the person you're going to sit in front of, be it real or virtual, is ultimately the CFO. And therefore, they are the stakeholder whom should always be involved, right? You might or might not have a regular interaction with them. I would suggest that for annual budget planning, you have a reasonable excuse, if I could say, to actually get time with that individual or someone in his team or her team to basically make sure that, you understand what the financial metrics that the firm is looking at in the coming fiscal year, what that looks like. You sort of have a sense for what your own budget might be, so you can sort of test the water in terms of if you're asking for incremental increases in these areas, is that going to be something which will be readily accepted or not? And with any luck, depending on who you report to, you might actually get to be able to test your presentation and your budget ahead of actually doing it for real. In my experience of doing this, you often get more than one shot at this. The sort of the series of meetings where this is decided is not just one thing necessarily. It'll be over a period of time, but there'll be one of the events where it's actually going to be, okay, really talk to us in detail about what it is that you want. So being on the inside track with the CFO, I think, is key. And as I said in the video, other stakeholders whom you can talk to ahead of that meeting sort of helps you prepare and equip yourselves when you go spend time with that individual, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I'll piggyback on something Chris said in the video. When you go to your first, when you set up the pitch to begin with, you should expect questions to come up that you can't answer.
Yep.
And whether you schedule the first pitch with a follow-on, so that everybody knows, okay, we're in this meeting, we're identifying things that need to be circled back on. As prepared as I am, that's a great point that I don't have the data on. Rather than guess, let me go back, regroup, and bring you the answer. And we already have that, or we'll schedule the follow-on coming down there. So it's not, I think one of the things that we're talking about here is it's not this is not a one and done. You only get one chance. This is, how do you set this up so that the process is a perfect process for the pitch? All right, folks, you can use the group chat to send us more info or questions or weigh in. We also have more in the Q&A. So I'll just roll down to the other one here, Nigel. We've got, so Russ again. Thank you, Russ, for engaging. Agree perfect pitch needs to involve getting other department stakeholders involved, like business analysts, users, and other stakeholders to quantify needs or quantity needs. And I think here, thanks, Russ, again, this weighs into the know your audience, but also do that kind of investigative homework or lay the groundwork to develop those networks early on. And you can come from that from a perspective of curiosity on how IT can better help the business.
Yeah, remember, at the end of the day, finance people don't like surprises. So anything that you can do to manage surprises is a good thing, right? Certainly in terms of if you're running at a project, let's say, that's become wildly successful, and as a result of that, you're going to have to go and ask for an out-of-budget cycle increase in spend because the thing that's been developed and delivered is absolutely delivering real business value, and people can see that, right? Those are pretty easy conversations to have because I think the business case in terms of the successful nature of what it is that you've done kind of justifies itself. The ones where you've got the out-of-cycle spend, where you've missed something, where a piece of information that maybe a supplier provided to you is factually incorrect and you only discover this at some sort of later date. This is typically around licensing, around cost of replacing for new equipment, etc. Those are harder conversations to have, but absolutely stand your ground. Make sure that people understand that whilst this is an out-of-cycle ask and it was something that is not necessarily captured during the normal budget cycle, Doesn't mean it's invalid, doesn't mean it's not important. It just means that we're going to have to go back to the business and ask to sort of fund something to make sure that we maintain a rock solid set of infrastructure on which we are building and maintaining IT, which of course is fundamental to running the business. Not an easy conversation to have, and I've had to have it a couple of my times myself, but if you present it in an honest way, a transparent way, and you show the reasons why you got to the point you got to, 9 times out of 10 you'll get an agreement to actually go and do the spend, right? And I'll also say you'll probably never get caught out in that way again, either by a supplier or by a piece of information that maybe wasn't checked more thoroughly, let's say, before a budget was prepared. So sometimes there are super really good reasons to have a conversation, sometimes they're not, but if you're honest and transparent and open with the people you're talking to, by and large, that comes across the right way. It shows maturity and professionalism on your part, and it's something that is manageable if it's managed correctly. Let me put it that way.
Absolutely. In some level, it's never too early to get to know your audience. Your audience is going to change, but if you can develop that broad landscape or surveying of your audience, when these things come up, if you already have those networks, if you've developed that rapport, it's going to make those conversations easier, and you'll be able to key in on where you need to key in for the different folks that you're presenting to. We've got a couple questions here on OPEX and CAPEX. I have my perspectives. I think arguably it's going to be very company specific. From the folks that we've spoken with, that seems to be the answer is it depends, and it's going to depend a lot on what your finance office is familiar with or open to. I think that one way to sum this up is spending money is spending money. You can't change the way you spend money just because you call it CAPEX or OPEX. Arguably, it all turns into cash outflow. Sometimes there will be tax incentives that will make one way of spending money more attractive than another way of spending money. And that will be either country specific or even company specific. Could even be division specific. Nigel, what are your thoughts on this whole OPEX, CAPEX, and the economic impact?
Yeah, so I think if you wind the clock back 5 years, the view the industry had was it was all going to go public cloud, and that therefore people were preparing themselves for what that meant. I think wisdom has ultimately prevailed, and that probably most of the folks on this call are managing some sort of multi-cloud or hybrid-based environment. So in that instance, there is still a requirement for capital purchase because you still need to maintain an on-premise facility in some way, shape, or form. And there is a move to subscription-based services, perhaps in terms of software licensing, in terms of how you do collaboration software. Maybe the use of Microsoft Teams, for example, is a subscription-based service, whereas traditionally you might have bought a telephone system and deployed it on-premise, right? In the case of the data center world, and in case of what we're talking about here, the pendulum tends to settle back in the middle. So there's always going to be a requirement for capital. There'll always be a requirement for operational. The movement has been to operational, but as I think we called out in the video, CapEx is good for some companies. They like physical asset. You can borrow money against them. You can put them on your balance sheet, right? So there's sometimes a financial reason why actually spending capital assets or acquiring capital assets is a good thing. And Dave, you're right. In the UK at the moment, for example, there are tax incentives in place that if I bought a server, let's say that was worth $100, I could get $130 worth of tax relief on that. So it's actually beneficial for me to be making that as a capital purchase rather than an operational license. Now, again, globally and locally in the countries where you are, those rules will be different. But sometimes what seems like technically the right thing to do is financially the wrong thing to do. And sometimes that financially the wrong thing to do is technically the right thing to do, right? But I don't think you end up in a position where you're in the outlier cases. You tend to find, as I said, the pendulum swinging through the middle. And if your CFO comes to you and says, Nigel, spend money in a capital budget because it's actually good good for us to do that, you know what? You might actually adjust your budget accordingly to actually make that a reality, okay? And maybe services that you were thinking about running in the cloud, you might say, you know what? I'm actually going to bring those back on-premise as part of a workload migration where maybe some applications that perhaps were destined to go in the public cloud might actually end up back in technology that I own, because the finance guy or girl has said to me, it's worth me doing that. Okay, so sometimes there'll be a set of decisions, as I said, that financially you look at and go, well, technically that's probably not the direction we were headed in, but I guess I understand why we're doing it. And I said the flip is always true. So, you know, and Dave, I think you summed it up perfectly. There's always going to be this tension between the two. I think the old days of pure CapEx are gone. The days of pure OpEx, I'm not sure we'd ever see those either. But depending on where you are as a business and depending on how you're preparing your own IT budgets, you yourselves will have seen this shift, right? And you will have also seen the appetite that your finance teams have for supporting you in this shift, or in some cases resisting you in this shift, right? So, you know, we might have the best technology strategy in the world, but if the finance guys and girls don't agree with it for different reasons, we should respect that. And if it helps us adjust course, but still deliver an outstanding end result, you know, that's still an outstanding end result, right?
Absolutely. And if you have your business case that you've done and it says, well, the answer is OpEx or the answer is CapEx or whatever, and you have that conversation with the finance folks and they disagree, that's a great opportunity for them to work with you and say, okay, well, let's work together. This is my model. How is it incorrect for what you need with the business, or what did I not, you know, it's a learning opportunity, right?
And there's often a misconception, right? I think we called it out earlier, and there was a comment in the chat actually, you know, that finance people are not necessarily technically oriented. For those of you who have the ability to go on courses where the title for the course might be Finance for IT People, certainly in the UK, we run those. So the ability for you to sort of step into the financial realm, not to be suddenly a qualified accountant or an absolute expert in this area, but to understand the terminology, to understand the language that finance people use, to understand why they might be saying certain things because it will affect the way that you structure the budget. And I think it's relatively easy for IT people to sort of become financially a little bit more savvy. I think it's incredibly difficult for finance people to become tech savvy because this world moves so quickly, and the principles that we would have employed even 5 years ago don't necessarily apply today. But accounting principles from 5 years ago absolutely still apply today. So the pace of change on the technology side is difficult, more difficult to grasp. So I think where you have an opportunity through an educational purpose to actually go out and learn the language and sort of begin to immerse yourself a little bit in this financial conversation, that's a very, very good thing to do, right? Very, very good thing to do.
Absolutely. Let's see, folks, if you do have more questions, please do use the group chat or the Q&A. If you don't, Nigel, do you guys have anything coming up on Thursday this week out there across the pond?
No. Apparently, you all are cooking meat and drinking beer, which is something I've never understood myself. But no, it's going to be quiet for us here in the UK. But for those of you who are watching this, who will be celebrating Thanksgiving, you know, have a fantastic day with you and your family. I think it's an awesome opportunity to get everybody together, and it is a uniquely US experience, I think. But on that side, I think, you know, don't worry, the rest of us will be propping up the wheel. We'll be carry on working.
Good. I was worried, but now that you said that, I'm not worried at all. And I will be eating my turkey and stuffing and cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, gravy, all of that fantastic stuff. Looks like we have hit everything in the Q&A. Looks like group chat is winding down. Folks, thank you very much for attending. This is the third in our series. The other two are available for on demand on convergedusergroup.com, resources and news portion of the website. We also have the fourth session coming up. Thank you, Jenny, for putting that in the chat. That will be delivering the pitch, I believe. We've developed it. We've assessed, we've financed, we've developed, and now we're going to deliver it. So get your water with lemon and, so your vocal cords are all good there. We will get that squared away. I think we'll go more in depth than just whether we can hold the note. Right?
Yeah, I think, and we're really honoured to be joined by Suzanne Pickett, I think, on that. And Suzanne, formerly a VP at US Bank, huge amount of experience in sort of, coaching members of her team as to how to sort of, take the content that you've spent a lot of time preparing and making sure that on the day that, you have the best, format for how you intend to deliver that content, but also the style that you use, the way in which you actually present it. Suzanne and I will walk folks through that. So, we're going to be recording that in the not too distant future, and would appreciate your involvement in that in terms of coming along to one of these sessions, right? Because there's a huge amount of effort that goes into creating these, and your support and continued viewing is really important to us.
Yes, we love that. And thank you, folks. And that's going to be Tuesday, December 7th at noon Eastern. Same time, same channel, Tuesday, December 7th.
I'll be wearing a different top, though.
I will be wearing my thinking cap as always, and probably bouncing around between my my lounge and